Populism. This is an online lecture and discussion series organized by the Finnish Cultural and Academic Institutes. My name is Uula Neitola, and I will present you the program of the event. But before that, a few words about the series itself. Beyond Populism enters into the role of a researcher and institutes as producers of research information in the era of populism. One of the basic tasks of research is social interaction. This task is carried out by researchers and research institutions by popularizing the research results. Beyond Populism is an online lecture and discussion series on research information and populism. It is organized by the Finnish Academic and Cultural Institutes, in which significant researchers and influencers working in the field of science and culture from Finland and abroad are consulted as experts. The series is part of the events of the Year of Research-Based Knowledge 2021. This event is a second in a 9-part series, and it is hosted by the Finnish Institutes in Germany. The focus today is on Dr. Antto Vihma, leading researcher in the Global Security Program at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, who lectures under topic The Era of Nostalgia. There will be time for discussion and in the end of the event. I would remind you that to keep your microphones closed during the lecture. The chat will be open throughout the event, and you can write your questions there if you wish. The lecture will be recorded, and the recording will be available on our YouTube channel the next 14 days after the lecture. Next, I would like to give the stage to the director of the Finnish Institute in Germany, Laura Hirvi. Laura, you are welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Hirvi, and as the director of the Finnish Institute in Germany, I also want you to warmly welcome to today's lecture by Dr. Antto Vihma. Let me introduce you to him. Dr. Antto Vihma works as a leading researcher in the Global Security Program at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and functions as an adjunct professor at the University of Eastern Finland. Vihma has published widely on global politics and governance in leading journals such as International Affairs, Geopolitics, and Global Environmental Politics. Vihma has been a visiting fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 2015 and 16, and at Sciences Po in 2013 in France. Vihma has also hosted a popular podcast aired by the Finnish broadcasting company Yle, together with the historian Miikka Tervonen. Antto Vihma has been awarded the Emil Öhman Foundation Travel Grant and is a guest researcher at the Finnish Institute in Germany in May. We are very much looking forward, Antto, to welcome you finally in Berlin at the Finnish Institute as our visiting guest researcher there. But today's presentation is based on Dr. Vihma's research, and he will analyze the current interconnection between nostalgia and populism. Without further ado, I would like to give the word to Dr. Antto Vihma, and let me just briefly remind you, if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat section, and we will address them later after the lecture. Please, Antto, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for inviting me to have this introduction lecture on a very, very interesting theme of nostalgia. I work for the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, as the Chair kindly already mentioned. It's an independent research institute that functions administratively under the Finnish Parliament, but I only speak for myself. As always. I'm gonna put on some slides. Hopefully you will see them in a very short while. So here's the topic of today's introductory remarks on the wide theme of nostalgia. And I'm trying to discuss the issue as the chair already noted in the context of populism. Dear friends and colleagues, nostalgia, I would think, is something that we see in politics all the time at the moment. So my starting point, should I say, is that nostalgia has become one of the primary movers of politics in Western countries. And I'm trying to focus the presentation a little bit. That's why I'm talking about Western countries. But you will see that I tie the concept of nostalgia pretty closely to the concept of modernity itself and modernization process. So in that way, it touches upon most of the planet and not only Western countries. Maybe I should, before I jump into the substance, maybe I should say that the project I'm working on now is actually, it works for the same mission as was outlined by Ulla. It's about popularization of science, and I'm working on a popular book called Nostalgia, Theory and Practice, and it will be out in September. So you can also consider this as an early advertisement for that book. It will be out in September in Finnish. Unfortunately, only I'm trying to do everything that's in my powers to have it translated and published also in English and Swedish, but I have nothing on paper on that yet, but definitely I'm working towards that goal. Nostalgia, you can see it in contemporary politics in all across the left-right spectrum of parliamentary politics. You could say that it's quite pronounced, for example, in the center-left, in the social democratic parties in Europe, the Democratic Party of or in the US, for example, as a nostalgia for the achievements of the welfare state, the latter half of the 20th century. You could make the case that the more radical left is nostalgic for the prospect of revolution, that there's a kind of revolutionary nostalgia among the radical left that's visible both in the philosophy and let's say the high discourse on what the revolution actually means today, whether it's possible at all and at what premises, and also in a very kitsch manifestations of revolutionary nostalgia, such as some popular T-shirts and so forth. However, my book and this presentation focuses on authoritarian populist movements. And this is, again, for some parts, only to narrow down the very wide field of nostalgia and its politics. But it's also because authoritarian populist movements have become, they use nostalgia in a very pronounced way. It's almost everywhere present in their messaging. And also they have become very relevant. They have increased their political clout so significantly under the, let's say, past 10 years. So these are the reasons why we should focus on them, especially in context of nostalgia. And nostalgia is understood here as a historical and political emotion. So it's an emotion that a person feels, but it's also something very collective, and it has implications both for historical thinking and politics. I follow quite closely studies of Svetlana Boym, who was a Harvard professor, unfortunately died 6 years ago of cancer. I was a leading scholar and wrote a fantastic let's say, eye-opening work called The Future of Nostalgia in 2001. And she kind of, let's say, kickstarted study of nostalgia in many fields. Also, I would like to outline a starting point or a proposition that nostalgia is a fundamentally modern condition. So it's not something that that's like inherently a human experience. Some kind of dreams of a golden age were very present already among the ancient Greeks. Homecoming as a theme is big in Iliad and even more pronounced in Ulysses. Homecoming as a theme is very present in the Old Testament, for example. So certainly there is a so-called prehistoria of nostalgia, but as an intensive emotion, as we currently understand it, it's very much a product of modernity. If we want to look at nostalgia in politics and go a bit further than saying that it's some kind of political emotion, one way to further analyze it is by looking at supply and demand of nostalgia. And today I'm mostly going to be talking about the demand side of nostalgia. So the reasons and implications of people being nostalgic. The supply side is also very interesting and quite pronounced today. There are many statistical researches, many reports and questionnaires being filed over the years, according to which more than 50% of people in many countries, hundreds of millions citizens altogether, believe that life was better 50 years ago. So now we are on the demand side of nostalgia. I would like to add that without the demand side, the supply side by the politicians and demagogues would actually probably die down pretty soon. They have to kind of expect a demand for their political messaging. But this kind of like basic fundamental nostalgic orientation is very, very common today. And looking at the supply, all we need to look is actually the most prominent slogans that have been expressed, for example, by the Tea Party, which started to radicalize the Republican politics in the US about 10 years ago. Their slogan, one of the main ones, was "Take America Back." Then, of course, Donald Trump made history with his campaign and slogan, "Make America Great Again." And two of the most pronounced, the most common slogans of the Brexit campaign were, "We want our country back" and "Take back control." So it's pretty clear. One doesn't have to be a textual analyst by profession to kind of see that there is a nostalgic inclination in these slogans. I'm using terms of political scientist Norris and Inglehart, Ronald Inglehart, a veteran on the field, authoritarian populism. Many would talk about right-wing populism or far-right populism and so forth. I find authoritarian populism a bit more analytically sound. Populism has its victories and defeats, and I think that perhaps currently the 21 year might not be a big year for authoritarian populism. We've already seen Donald Trump lose elections. The AfD in Germany does not look very strong going into the elections. It's very divided and not campaigning effectively. And it's very possible, likely, that we will see Marine Le Pen lose an election against Emmanuel Macron later in the year. But taken together in a bit more longer term, authoritarian populism is gaining ground. If we look at the support of authoritarian populists in the parliaments in Europe, for example, it has steadily been gaining ground in the 90s, in 2000, in 2010, every decade. If we aggregate these into 10-year slots, the percentage of authoritarian populism keeps rising. It's already very prominent. It has multiple of implications to democracy, especially liberal democracy, and it has lasting impacts. Many of my colleagues would argue that Viktor Orban has really transferred Hungary into another kind of democracy altogether. And of course, Brexit vote is a rupture that will not that will not be revised. It's a very lasting political earthquake in Europe. So this also kind of helps us to focus on populism. It's not about one election or two elections. It's a big trend. However, before we go into today's issues, I'd like to go back in time to nostalgia itself. Where and when did it come about? On the left-hand side, you see the cover of a dissertation, medical dissertation of a certain young Swiss doctor, Johannes Hofer, who submitted this thesis in 1688. And in this dissertation, Dissertatio Medica de Nostalgia, in Basel University, 1688, this was the first time the word nostalgia was used. And our good doctor, Johannes Hofer, and his supervisors at that time, these dissertations were largely product of the supervisors as well, but let's not get into that. History will remember Johannes Hofer as the author of this dissertation and this word. So he actually coined the word nostalgia out of two Greek words, nostos, meaning homecoming, and algos, meaning longing, pain. Sorry about my Greek pronouncing. It's a very interesting read, but we kind of, the starting point is very different than what nostalgia is today, but then again, there are similarities. But definitely it was understood as a medical condition. It was something that you caught. You could catch a nostalgia in a way that you catch a flu these days, or in a way you caught tuberculosis in 1688. And there was a demand for this concept as well. So it was introduced in many medical taxonomies right after this first publication. So in the 18th century, nostalgia was a disease. And if we look at what the good Dr. Hofer said about nostalgia, his original diagnosis was that the uncommon and ever-present idea, the recalled native land in the mind, causes, quote, continued sadness, meditation only of the fatherland, disturbed sleep, either wakeful or continuous, decrease of strength, hunger, thirst, senses diminished, and cares or even palpitations of the heart, frequent sighs, fevers that are continual or intermitted. And if nostalgia was left untreated, it would hasten death by exhaustion. So it was a severe disease, and people actually died of nostalgia. So you can read autopsy reports where doctors examine the body and note that this patient died of a nostalgia. And although it sounds maybe a bit strange for us to think of nostalgia in these medical terms, and we shouldn't ridicule the young Swiss doctor's account in any way, because his description of the symptoms of nostalgia, they come quite close to the modern understanding of severe depression. And diagnosis of low mood and sadness and depression is a subject of long-standing debate in Western medical history. It should be seen as part of that. And the diagnosis of nostalgia, why did it come about and was so demanded in 1688? I think that's a very precious question, and there's not enough time today maybe to thoroughly discuss this. But there were definitely some outbreaks of modernity at that time already. There was the spread of monetary economy was going strongly. There was a trend of urbanization was picking up. There was a lot of movement of people, and Johannes Hofer in his study takes examples of migrants who actually fall for this homesickness. They are a Swiss country girl who goes to serve as a maid in Paris and falls ill of nostalgia and so forth. And it was definitely seen as a soldier's disease during the 18th century. And the system of military became a bit different when ordinary people became more involved in warfare as citizen soldiers. So there are many kind of factors going on. Also, the dynamic development of medical science at that time plays a role. But what happened was that gradually, in a very long process, in 150, even 200 years long process, nostalgia was demedicalized. And especially during the 19th century, it began to acquire its modern meaning. And nostalgia became a feeling, not a disease. And also it was less attached to place, to spatial dimension, and more attached to time, as we now understand nostalgia. So it was a long process of demedicalization, and it didn't come about with one event, let's say one study, or a political event like the French Revolution, or even a movement, like Romanticism, for example. These all played their part, but they weren't like, it was definitely a gradual change, a long process of demedicalization, which is actually pretty interesting as such. But what the 19th century meant was a period of turmoil for the common people. And this took place in the same time as the birth of mass culture and kind of the spread of newspapers and a creation of a different kind of public sphere, which also kind of connects the individual feelings to the culture. I think it would be, I'm not a historian, so a word of caution here, but my historians colleagues would probably agree that it's quite hard to overstate the impact of the French Revolution. And I'm talking about French Revolution as the revolutionary era. So let's take Napoleonic Wars into account as well. The whole turmoil, it touched upon a great many people in Europe, and it was a very great novelty in a way. Of course, some people expected a revolution, but many did not, and it shattered what some people thought, many people thought, was a very kind of stable order. And second issue that takes place in the same time, I'm going to skip the issue of Romanticism here, which made an impact definitely on how to think about longing and nostalgia and nationalism. But the Industrial Revolution caused dramatic ruptures in people's lives, and this level of change was something that we certainly did not see in let's say early Renaissance in Italy, for example. So the scale of change was huge, and the sense of rupture was great. One of the era's most famous historians, Johannes von Müller, was just writing his masterpiece, his magnus opus on contemporary history when the French Revolution started. And he wrote to his brother several letters which repeated his kind of bewilderment. Everything is becoming so different. Everything is becoming so different. And this was not, actually one of the greatest historians of the period. So what kind of nostalgia is there? Can we make some fruitful distinctions? I am now taking the liberty of applying Svetlana Boym, the theoretician that I already mentioned, and her categories of restorative and reflective nostalgia. Both are types of nostalgia. They are kind of ideal types, but they are very different. And to illustrate the differences between the two, I pick up two gentlemen that we see here. They are both looking at the past, but their look is quite different. On the right-hand side, we see Joseph de Maistre, who's kind of, I would also almost say it's judgmental, but it might have the, it might be because I have had the pleasure of reading his works, and he's absolutely almost, a very, very archetype of almost a bloodthirsty reactionary thinker. And he is our example of restorative nostalgia. On the left-hand side, we see Viscount François-René de Chateaubriand, who's also looking at the past, but his look is much more pensive. And you can see he's also pictured in a romantic setting. And he represents now reflective type of nostalgia. Joseph de Maistre and restorative nostalgia. Mark Lilla, History of Ideas professor in Columbia, noted that this kind of restorative nostalgia settled like a cloud over European thinking after the French Revolution, and it has never since fully lifted. So after this period, it has always been part of our politics, and but its significance varies. It's not a constant. And de Maistre and other restorative nostalgics have a story to tell, and this story has always some common characteristics. There is a state of wholeness. There is a kind of a healthy, ordered place where people know what they do, they know their place, they act by tradition, probably serve their God, and there is some kind of at least relative stability and healthy order. Then there are new ideas, poisonous ideas, that are spread by intellectuals, professors, journalists, those types of people, politicians, of course. And these new ideas, they rot the healthy order. The metaphor of rotting is always present. It's what de Maistre already used at the French Revolution. And so the old order becomes weak and collapses when it faces the revolutionary challenge. But there's a group of people who are the restorative nostalgics who can see through these modern lies. And it's up for them to put on a struggle and restore the old order. This is in a nutshell the political story of restorative nostalgia. When we think of the word nostalgia, the focus is on the former part, the nostos, the homecoming. So they present a mythical golden age, a mythical picture, snapshot of the past. And also what Mark Lilla notes is that betrayal of the elites is always part of this story. The liberal elites are betraying the good of the people and the country. And here we see an intimate connection to populism of today. Liberal elites were described by de Maistre as pourriture du patriciat, so the rotten parts of the nobility. And de Maistre famously also said that it was the revolution was crime from the people, but it was an unforgivable sin from the liberal nobility who supported parts of the revolution. So that was the most disgusting part of the whole revolution for de Maistre, and Napoleon himself agreed that that's the case. So de Maistre was very influential at his time, a very influential thinker and diplomat. That's another reason for taking him up as an example. So the reflective nostalgia, on the other hand, a very different tradition of nostalgia. It also springs from the sadness caused by the current state of affairs, but the starting point is always that the past cannot be restored. It cannot be brought back anymore. That's the starting point of reflective nostalgia. And as Svetlana Boym points out, just because you have nostalgic feelings, it doesn't mean that your brain is being turned off, that you can be easily manipulated to believe anything. Reflective nostalgia focuses on the longing part, the algos in nostalgia, the latter part. It lingers on the longing feeling and the incomplete process of memory. It problematizes how we remember things and what do we actually remember. What are the fragments of the past that we remember? And it also helps the reflective nostalgic to form a narrative of survival. But it's his own narrative, or at least there is a multitude of narratives. It's not the only one narrative that you have in the reactionary restorative nostalgia. And as Boym notes, algos, the longing, is something that we share. It's also a potential for solidarity is there. And also it can be, as indeed many artists from literary genius of Marcel Proust to many romantic painters to, well, a great deal of philosophy, shows that these kind of distances and longing and nostalgia can be a source of creativity if used correctly. Fragments of the past can be turned into wonderful things in a reflective and creative process. When one reads the memoirs of Viscount Chateaubriand, I find it funny that it's so modern. The text it has a modern feel to it, although it was written in the early 19th century. One example is this passage where he says that a man does not have a single consistent life. He has several laid end to end, and that is his misfortune. There's always a time when we possess nothing of what we now possess, and a time when we have nothing of what we once had. So it's evident that the change is very fundamental theme for Chateaubriand, and it's something that troubles him. He writes also not as a single person. He doesn't intend his writing as just memories of an old man who had some misfortunes. He uses the universal tone here. A man does not have single consistent life. Humans don't have, he means. And the feeling of this of these ruptures is that of misfortune. So there is sadness. So it's pretty clear that although he doesn't use the word nostalgia, Chateaubriand is actually writing about reflective nostalgia. And many people also found ways to relate to his memories. They became a great literary source for many, a classic to be. So it's not only us who live in a very different place. It's also at the time many common people kind of related to Chateaubriand, although he was a nobleman, and he was exiled forced to exile in Britain, and he made a voluntary exile to US and so forth and so forth. He had a very different life than most people, but these themes still resonated among people. I would like to add a third category of nostalgia, something that Svetlana Boym also, I feel, kind of discusses, but doesn't add as a category in itself, and that would be banal nostalgia. Because it seems that there's quite a lot of nostalgia in our practices and in our everyday life that's neither restorative or populist, that we would actually want to bring the old order back, or that it would be deep and creative and reflective, that would actually make us think about our life and our life story, and reflect upon who we are and what kind of changes we have seen. There is nostalgia as a comfort blanket, nostalgia as just something that passes the time, something that makes you feel kind of nice. And certainly this banal nostalgia, banal manifestation of nostalgia are also very commercial. There is a whole nostalgia industry, for example, in the pop culture. That's only one example. You could say that nostalgia is being used to sell us quite many different commodities, but it's very pronounced in popular music these days. Popular music endlessly referring to itself and to certain different golden eras that might not even be that far away. And Simon Reynolds has a fantastic book called Retromania on this very topic. It's kind of a critical study of the phenomena, and it's centered around technological change, which has caused the situation that there's so much cultural products that are stored and readily available for us at any moment from the recent history that makes us very different than any preceding generation. So we have YouTube filled with different versions of any popular culture event almost that one can imagine, and we can curate our own nostalgic playlists with a snap of our fingers in Spotify, and so forth and so forth. So this has made the availability, again, the kind of the supply side of nostalgia in completely different spheres than it was, for example, in my childhood in the 80s. However, the concern of excess dwelling on recent history, or a bit further history as well, is not new. It was pronounced, for example, in Nietzsche's Misuses and Misuses of History book in the late 19th century, and probably even before that. For me, it reminds definitely of Nietzsche's work. So it has this kind of criticism has a history of its own, of banal nostalgia, and whether that's actually blocking some of the culture's creativity. We come to the question, why now? Why is nostalgia so pronounced now in our politics and in our culture? So why are we in this regard in a similar place as a gentleman Chateaubriand and de Maistre were in the early 19th century. I have some propositions that I'd like to introduce to you, and they are a bit work under construction. So I would very much hope you would not perhaps quote them, at least directly, should you be focusing on the same topic in your future work. Anyway, they will be published pretty soon in some form, at least with the book in September. My proposition for the current wave of nostalgia, what's behind it, what is behind the demand side of nostalgia in contemporary politics and culture, is that there are 4 revolutions going on. And I think all of them, the metaphor of revolution has been used by almost all of them. And it doesn't sound excessive to me. The first one is what I already touched upon with Retromania and Simon Reynolds, is technological change. One driver of nostalgia is digitalization and current technological change, which certainly has caused huge disruptions in people's everyday life and the feeling of rupture and change. I don't think that there are actually that many technological innovations that have affected the everyday life of people as much as the smartphone. I believe that smartphone is in top something of innovations of all time in the way that it changes the everyday life through the enabled communication, through the access, and through different other aspects of life that become digitalized, different forms of production and so forth, and ways of consumption. Of course, the communicative dimension with the social media is probably the #1 thing anyway. Secondly, demographic change is a much longer process of aging population. Population is aging a lot in Europe and in US as well, in Japan, Russia, of course, in many places, in China as well. And the older we get, the more change we've seen, and all the surveys that have been conducted about nostalgia, they reiterate that older people are more nostalgic than younger people. That's maybe it's self-evident. Urbanization causes nostalgia. It has throughout its history been a source of nostalgia, and today is no exception. And it does so both in the countryside, which loses population, and then of course in the cities with the dreams of the lost wholeness of the city, of the countryside. So it works both ways. And also the diversification of the demographic in Western Europe and Eastern Europe as well is definitely a factor. Immigration, it's relatively new phenomena. European countries were very homogeneous still at the end of Cold War, and this kind of diversification of people also causes political emotions and nostalgia for the golden period, supposed golden period before it took place, whether we like it or not. And the third factor or driver I'd introduce with political scientist Ronald Inglehart again is the silent revolution, which means the kind of the triumph of liberal values. It's very much epitomized by the 60s. If there is one place where nostalgic, restorative nostalgics, populists like to point out where the rot set in, where our healthy order was being rottened from its core, it was the 60s and the march of counterculture and liberalism, which actually made a lot of progress in the early 70s, but the 60s is kind of the symbolic turning point of the silent revolution. This concerns the role of women, the recognition and the rights of minorities, equal marriage possibilities, abortion, etc., etc. The kind of the triumph of liberal values, and that causes a cultural backlash as well, and drives nostalgic feelings for those who have always felt uncomfortable by this social liberalism. Fourthly, I'd like to argue that geopolitical changes also drive nostalgia, and especially a nationalist nostalgia. And we nowadays live in an emerging multipolar order. When I go to the seminars in the field of international affairs, multipolar order or multipolarity or non-polarity is always mentioned. That's a great theme in global politics these days, and it works also in many ways. Europe is troubled by losing its relevance. Europe used to run things, West used to run things, US definitely used to run things in the latter part of the 20th century. It was the superpower that defeated Soviet Union bloc, and now its power is in some relative decline, and same goes for Europe. And this feeds nationalistic trauma and feelings of nostalgia. But however, it's not the only mechanism that geopolitical changes works through. It might be the most obvious, but I also argue that the countries that are rising in relevance, the regional powers that are rising, let's say Turkey, Brazil, China. Well, China is not a regional power, it's very much a global power broker, but these rising players, they also use nostalgia in order to legitimize their rise. They think of, they draw from nationalism and their past empires to kind of legitimize that they are the big players, and they have kind of great power privileges. So it's not only the declining ones that turn to nostalgia, it's also the rising ones. Those are kind of the contemporary drivers that we could discuss in greater detail as long as till the cows come home. However, it's late on a Wednesday evening, and I'm not looking to exhaust my presentation and exhaust you guys with the presentation. It's kind of hard to really wrap up the big theme of nostalgia and populism. And I certainly don't have a silver bullet, a cure to fix the problematic sides of nostalgia. Although I have been quite clear that I don't think that all nostalgia is politically poisonous. And again, this kind of to see political nostalgia as something that's problematic. It stems from worry of the state of democracy. So there's a commitment to democratic and even liberal democratic principles that makes me and many others worry about the restorative nostalgic trends, because it feeds authoritarian thinking. Anyway, there is definitely a need to better recognize nostalgia as a driver and tool for populism, both as a driving force, as something that's very embedded in our culture and politics. And the standard explanation that one still sees a lot in journalism, the so-called economic anxiety explanation, or losers of globalization, the same thing, are not adequate explanations. And this has been seen in multiple heaps and piles of analysis of Trump's first campaign or the Brexit campaign. These explanation models just don't, they are not satisfactory. First of all, people themselves, when asked what motivates you to vote for a restorative nostalgic, for an authoritarian populist, they would say that they are ideological factors. They themselves would, in most studies, actually highlight that the drivers are ideological and not economic. And this was true already with the Tea Party in the US more than 10 years ago. It was driven by cultural concerns and not actually economic concerns, according to many studies. And second thing is that when you look at the actual voters of Trump or other authoritarian populist movements that have made it, that have become popular, actually, that are successful, always the result is that there's a lot of elite in there. There's lots of people who actually don't objectively suffer for any kind of economic anxiety, or are not objectively can be seen as some kind of losers of globalization. It's just a very forceful narrative that has for a long time dominated, in my opinion, discussion, and journalism has its part to play in it, because it's a very lucrative story. But it can be naive. It can be also a failure to see political demands that are not same as what we might have as what they are. So there's an element of comfort in this, that actually they are people who are under false consciousness. What they actually would like to have is more welfare state, or so forth. I might be a bit too ironic here, but I would definitely like to see more analysis in the study of authoritarian populism, more analysis of nostalgia, since it seems to play a rather central role in the campaigning. The next order question would be how to address the problems of restorative nostalgia in a rapidly changing world. We probably can't slow down modernization. We can't slow down urbanization. We definitely can't slow down technological progress. So there is a dilemma here. Should it actually turn out that restorative nostalgia threatens the principles of democracy? And this question is especially relevant in a culture where many would say that art is losing at least some of its relevance. And some would add that philosophy is losing at least some of its relevance. And most would agree that religion has lost a lot of its relevance. So how to deal with the nostalgic drive? That's an open question. Again, there's no silver bullet here, but perhaps some kind of discussion on the topic is a starting point, and recognition of nostalgia in culture and politics would be a starting point. Denying nostalgia, kind of saying that nostalgia is only dangerous, that it leads to you being manipulated by populist leaders or commercial forces. I would not recommend that route. It would sound strategically unwise to leave nostalgia, and nationalism for that matter, only to the radical restorative nostalgics, only to populist movements. I think proponents of liberal democracy, progressives if you like, also have to chip in some way to the nostalgia discussion, and not not call a taboo on nostalgia and say that past was bad, future is good. This kind of framing, I don't see that it's a feasible political strategy for these kinds of movements. It doesn't. Yeah, there must be other ways to engage into nostalgia, and I believe also as a student of the phenomena that would be a very important path to take, and it's a challenge for politicians, but also to all of us living in Western democracies and caring about the state of a liberal democracy. With these rather big words, I would like to conclude my remarks. They were opening remarks. We have plenty of time for discussion, and hopefully we can talk about nostalgia also in the future events. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you.
Thank you, Antto. This was super interesting to learn about nostalgia from the conceptual side, and then also go to it, how it influences the politics. We have some questions here. Do you, by the way, hear my voice good? Because I hear some kind of back voice.
I hear you very well, Chair.
Okay, that's good. So the question that was raised here is, does nostalgia we encounter today operate in a similar way as the New Age movement? Tuve?
Sorry, Laura. Antto, could you put your microphone off while Laura is speaking? We have some disturbing noises, the rest of us. Thank you. Now it's good.
Yes. Okay. Now I hear myself also more clearly. It makes it easier for me to moderate. Yeah, I hadn't had that before, so I couldn't actually advise you on that. Sorry. Let's start actually with the first question we have here, because the first question kind of is a good way to kind of like start the conversation. So the first question we have in the chat is, have you seen an indication that feelings of nostalgia in some circles anyway stem from climate anxiety or actual climate change? Which is a super interesting question, I think.
Certainly. If we take them one by one, I don't claim to have all the answers of nostalgia, by the way, but to think about the question in a deliberative way, I think nostalgia, as well as populism, can be very flexible.
Hey, there is a problem. It's circling. Not the...
Okay, so you have mute now, Laura, which is probably fixes some of the circling voice. So I would like to. My concept of nostalgia and populism are very flexible. So I could very well see a nostalgia that has to do with climate change. That would actually.
Sorry, Antto, to disturb you. We have a problem with your sound. Could you put your microphone off? Turn it off again, please. And let's check if everyone else has the microphones off. I think so. And let's check now if you turn your microphone on again, Antto, and we'll try.
Is it any better? It's still bad. The sound is circling.
Two options that would come to my mind. One is, of course, a bit worrying that you answer some of the questions that are raised here in the chat form, or then you go out of the Zoom and enter again. Because it's strange, it just started now after kind of the whole lecture was very fine.
Well, that's very nice to hear. I'll go out of the Zoom and rejoin if that should work. We can try at least. Thank you.
We apologize for the short break. I'm sure Antto will be back soon.
It was interesting to learn actually that the concept of nostalgia is that old in a way. That was very, for me at least, that it's a PhD student who coined it. That gives hope to all the PhD students out there to come up with their own concepts. They might live longer than you do. So we learned that from nostalgia. So let's try it again.
Testing.
Yes.
Let's try.
Yes,
It's good
perfect.
again.
Yeah.
Perfect. I guess always with the technology, the right thing is to turn it off for a while and then start.
Exactly.
At least that's the only thing I'm capable of. Okay, well, to go back to the climate change, I was just gonna share a couple of brief thoughts. One is that it's easy to imagine a movement that's nostalgic for the era when we had great white winters and the climate was unchanged or in the state before this human intervention of last 50 years. However, there is definitely also the other type of nostalgia that's connected to this that we probably already see, which is nostalgia to the era when climate politics were not being implemented. And I think that's probably the first one of the climate nostalgic variants of the climate nostalgia that's going to be pronounced, is that people actually think of restorative nostalgia with the climate politics in mind when we didn't have a certain taxes or a bad conscience as consumers or so forth. But certainly there's going to be different types of climate nostalgia. They're going to be both restorative and reflective, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. There's another interesting question. Does the nostalgia we encounter today operate in a similar way as the New Age movement, in the sense that the people who utilize nostalgia as to further their own agenda have the tendency of sort of cherry picking only certain elements from the past rather than longing for a lost period in history as a whole?
That's a very good question, and I think it snaps right into the distinction of Svetlana Boym's concepts of restorative and reflective nostalgia, because in my mind, restorative nostalgia is always a snapshot and it's always a simplification. And populism as a political means of communication always drives for these kinds of simplifications. And this kind of supply side of nostalgia definitely uses the past that's made into a certain simple narrative. It doesn't long for the period and its complexities. And this kind of phenomena can turn out as quite ironic. You can have nostalgia to let's say 1930s as some kind of stable period of time. It can take various forms that have nothing to do with the actual history. So in this way, restorative nostalgia brings mythical thinking back to history. So in a way, I wouldn't call it New Age, but definitely there is that element of myth coming back, and perhaps the spirit of enlightenment and rationalism leaving. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Whereas reflective nostalgia can dwell on the complexities of different periods and what do we actually know of those periods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking of what you said of how nostalgia is used right now also in a marketing sense. And I think the whole Netflix is full of kind of like, you know, picking all the nostalgic elements that they find in culture and gluing them together and making a narrative on their own. Yeah, there's another question in the chat. If the rise of nostalgia is also connected to the important social transformations of the 60s, including the role of women, is there a misogynistic twist to it? I pronounce it right, misogynistic twist to it? Or is nostalgia a male disease?
Nostalgia is, again, in my view, it's certainly a very broad phenomena that I would connect to the whole of modernity and change, these kind of things, and it's pretty obvious that they affect all genders and sexes. But definitely, I mean, in a more limited sense, I mean, if we think of the current wave of restorative nostalgia, so I think as it is pronounced by populist parties, from a progressive standpoint, you could definitely make a case that it's misogynistic, and it's and it's, I would say, plain and simple anti-liberal. So it's broadly here like I think what Inglehart and Norris talk about this silent revolution and its effects in a they have heaps of material on it. It shows this kind of cultural backlash phenomena taking place. Their context is US politics, but they also draw from Britain and Europe. Mm-hmm. And yeah.
The next question is maybe a bit linked to the question, you know, like, can you kind of link nostalgia to a certain group? So the question goes, is there any evidence of the nostalgia belonging to a certain age group? And that maybe the younger generations, especially those who are born in the digital era, may have a different approach to nostalgia, possibly be less nostalgic.
Excellent question. And I hope I had more of like studies in mind that I could like quote here and throw on the table, but I don't have the exact references. But many studies point out to the fact that the nostalgic feeling as a kind of vague emotion, it takes a hold on people in their later stages of life. There's not much difference in many studies concerning whether you're 50 or whether you're 70, but there is a great difference of whether you're 20 or whether you're 40 or 50. So it certainly increases towards the middle ages, and I think that's pretty like it makes common sense in a way. You've seen changes in the world, and certainly young generation is more immersed in the now. And not nostalgic. And I think Svetlana Boym has a funny kind of point that you can actually be nostalgic to the pre-nostalgic era. You can be nostalgic to yourself when you weren't nostalgic, when you were actually living more in the present. And that takes place when you're young, when you're in love, when you are immersed in some cultural activity. You're part of a wave, a part of a movement. These kinds of periods are the ones that many people are then later in life nostalgic for. But I would then add that this feeling of change and the way that modern era modernizes itself constantly, I think the changes are going to be even more rapid in the future. So definitely the current generation that are digital natives, they might not see the digital revolution as we did, but they're going to see a great dramatic changes in their lifestyles in the coming 20, 30 years. So we can't make a bet, but I would pay my money that they will be very nostalgic at some point.
I did myself. One article I wrote on nostalgia, it was more based on an ethnographic research, and I think it's very interesting to think how nostalgia can be also something that people, let's say in Berlin, to bring the link to the city where basically, you know, the Finnish Institute is located, and what you see often here is that you talk to people who are nostalgic for the Berlin in the 80s that they never experienced. you know, they want cheap rents back, and they have this kind of like free lifestyle and not the posh cars and everything. And I think, yeah, the question of what kind of nostalgia are willing to what kind of people would be very interesting to put in relation to how you said nostalgia is fueling basically populism and is used by politics and politicians. So there are two more questions here. I'm going to read them. The first one is, what do you think of, for example, Zizek's point that change to be recognized in hindsight in historical view cannot be slight, but to be recognizably historically, changes have to be revolutions. Nostalgia would then fill the gap for longing for something else, not real change.
Yes, no, it's an interesting point. I have a very conflicted view on Slavoj Žižek, I sometimes admire greatly some of his basic insights, and then I think of him as a very terrible political strategist on the other hand. So there are that's a general remark. I would have to sit on that question a little bit. But it's definitely, Slavoj Žižek comes from that strand of leftist thinking that is very nostalgic to the idea of revolution. He's definitely one of those who wrestles with the fact that that the kind of the window of a socialist revolution in the West more or less closed in the late 60s after 68 in Paris. It became rather clear in a traumatic way that there wouldn't be a transformation to a socialist system. So he's one of those theoreticians who have tried to come up with different types of revolutions. So what kind he has drawn? Let's say he wrote a book about Apostle Paul, for example, like Alain Badiou. So they are thinking of political revolution in a very abstract way. They are saying that Saint Paul was one of the great revolutionaries, and they say that revolution is an event. It's something theological, political. While I think that's an interesting debate, it also speaks to me as kind of a distress about the actual possibilities of revolution. And that is an interesting and perhaps a fruitful political position too. But his is the theoretical nostalgia for a revolution, definitely.
Mm-hmm. So we have a last question. For the sake of the argument, we say that restorative nostalgia is related to authoritarian thinking. Do you see the possibility of restorative nostalgia being applied to a longing for liberal times?
Yeah, lovely question, because those are exactly the issues that I think we have to start start thinking. I'd say that restorative nostalgia, as like described by Svetlana Boym and others, that kind of bodes naturally well into authoritarianism and populism. They go very well hand in hand in several ways that I kind of hinted at. But certainly the liberal nostalgia could also try to restore something. And I think all politics, or most political thinking, has some kind of references to the past. It doesn't only go towards the future. Certainly, what is the liberal nostalgia? What kind of power it can yield? That's a fundamental issue in I think not only political theory but political practice as well in the next coming decades. And I for one, I'd like to take off my hat as a researcher now and say that I am kind of nostalgic for some liberal advances of the 90s. That's because that's when I was a 20-year-old person as well. So it's a mixture of personal and political here too.
Mm. Yes, I think we could go on, and I think you all left us. I said in the break when you were for a second away from the screen, I said thank you for all this information, and I was intrigued to learn that nostalgia is such an old and kind of new concept at the same time that was coined by a PhD student. So for one, and I'm sure we are very much looking forward for your or to the publication based on today's presentation. So I say thank you on behalf of the audience and of the Finnish Institute and the network of the Finnish Institutes in Finland. Thank you, Antto, for the presentation, and I give the word over to Ulla.
Thank you, Antto. Thank you, Laura. Thank you all for participating. I hope you enjoyed. As this is a series of lectures, at this stage I would promote the next episode of Beyond Populism, which will take place on 26th of May. The session will be organized by the Finnish Institute in the Middle East, and it will be about the Middle East and its scholars in publicity. More information is about to come. I end this session with these nostalgic words. Thank you and have a good night.